Our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people. The establishment has trillions of dollars at stake in this election. For those who control the levers of power in Washington and for the global special interest, they partner with these people that don't have your good in mind. The political establishment that is trying to stop us is the same group responsible for our disastrous trade deals, massive illegal immigration, and economic and foreign policies that have bled our country dry. The political establishment has brought about the destruction of our factories and our jobs as they flee to Mexico, China, and other countries all around the world. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. I'm doing this for the people and for the movement, and we will take back this country for you, and we will make America great again.
What is the Matrix? The Matrix is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth?
They're watching you, Neo.
Hello, welcome back to Inform New Hampshire. Today is February 20th, 2019. I'm your host, Rich Merritt. First of all, let's get started with Jerry DeLemus and Greg Burleson. I'm asking the president to pardon them for their innocence. They didn't do anything. Stood up against the swamp dwellers. They shouldn't be in prison. March 3rd, it'll be 3 years. 3 years in prison for something they didn't do. And if you want to see who should be in those prison cells, keep watching because you will see it. Secondarily, please go to the National Liberty Alliance.org and support their efforts to try to get these books out to the sheriffs. Whether they read them or not, I don't even know if the sheriffs know how to read, but they should be reading this information to find out what the law says. And the only way they're going to do that is if somebody helps them pay for the cost to have it printed and shipped to them. Make it easy for them. We're going to show a video today on it's America Under Siege from the bar. But it's specific to one individual, but there's a lot of other names mentioned. Just pay attention to the names that you see, and you'll find out exactly what I'm talking about. So with that, we can start this video. Thank you.
Mueller, a journey to the dark side.
Mueller is no patriot.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Whitey Bulger had a connection with the FBI. He wouldn't think twice about walking into your living room and blowing your brains out.
Commerce Secretary Ron Brown and 32 others were on a military plane that crashed today in a violent storm. There are no known survivors at this time.
There are no indications of a problem other than the obvious bad weather.
We wanted to go to San Diego and find out what an FBI informant is doing, providing cover and shelter for a Saudi terrorist, and Mueller tried to stop him.
He helped many of the key people that were connected to the Saudis and connected to the bin Laden family to escape the United States.
We now have in this country what is a runaway investigation. It's spinning out of control. It's led by Mueller and his merry band of Trump-hating deep state sycophants.
We're going to lose our entire culture and our society if we don't start standing up. I mean, there's no end to these crazy people.
The truth is collateral damage.
We caught him. We caught him. We exposed that this was going on.
If you look at Mueller's entire history, you see sort of the deep state fix-it man is the role that Mueller has played for the better part of 3 decades. Here's a guy who came from sort of the wealthy, affluent, old money families. So old money, it goes back to when New York was New Amsterdam. That's how far back his sort of old money, deep state ties go. So he goes to Princeton during the sort of the Ivy League peak days, part of the dining club culture there that's sort of like the secret societies of Yale and other places. Goes from there, he volunteers to serve as part of sort of the officer corps in Vietnam. It doesn't actually see any real problems or isn't harmed in any way, which is sort of a habit of those sort of more privileged kids who go off to war, somehow manage to come back unharmed and more frequently than not. Comes back, he becomes a lawyer. He joins the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of California and manages to work his way up to Boston. He becomes one of the assistant prosecutors in Massachusetts. Well, it's interesting who, when he is at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Massachusetts in Boston, well, guess who they are supervising as a secret witness, as a secret informant, who they are covering for? Whitey Bulger. That's what puts Robert Mueller on the map in terms of the political space. He becomes one of the key people involved who helps keep 4 innocent people in a state prison in Massachusetts by covering for the fact that, in fact, Whitey Bulger was the mob boss, the Boston mob boss, who was responsible for the crime that those 4 innocent people were serving in prison for. Mueller parlays that successful cover-up of the Whitey Bulger criminal regime that was involved with the FBI in Boston into a position under the Bush Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. He becomes one of the key people there during key prosecutions, such as the prosecution of BCCI and the prosecution of Manuel Noriega. So BCCI was the money launderer's bank of choice. They had a former Kennedy attorney general who was one of their key bank private counsel. BCCI was where the drug dealers went. BCCI is where terrorists went. BCCI is where marginal political regimes that were under sanctions went. BCCI was basically the money laundering bank of choice for the world's rogues, the world's terrorists, the world's most violent criminal gangs and operations. What was key was that BCCI could implicate the CIA. BCCI could implicate high-ranking members of the intelligence infrastructure in the United States. BCCI could implicate high-ranking politicians, not only here in the United States, but other places in the world that were favorable to the intelligence and deep state infrastructure of America's political power hierarchy. And so that was where Bob Mueller stepped in again, the deep state fix-it man. He made sure the BCCI case didn't go far afield. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just read what William Safire wrote about, who was a columnist for the New York Times, wrote about what Robert Mueller was doing as to the BCCI case when he was interfering with the ability of the New York prosecutor to meaningfully look into the case. The New York State prosecutor, who had been the long-time head of the New York District Attorney's Office for Manhattan, the guy that they built the show Law and Order was premised upon, his legacy and his history, was trying to meaningfully investigate the various criminal activities of BCCI. Who was interfering? Robert Mueller at the Department of Justice under the Poppy Bush administration. This was documented and detailed repeatedly by William Safire on the pages of no less a publication than the New York Times itself. Despite this, the effect of it was that the BCCI case would never contaminate critical political figures in Washington or around the world, particularly those connected to corruption within our own intelligence infrastructure in the United States and in what's loosely called the Five Eyes in the United Kingdom and Australia and elsewhere. Bob Mueller would then parlay that success into the Manuel Noriega prosecution. Noriega, the longtime dictator of Panama, using his power as a head of the military to effectively control its political process, killing political adversaries, corrupting elections, having people disappear who would say bad things about him, like call him pineapple face or things like that in a very high-profile public way, who was the main drug runner's choice of political operative. And that there's a reason why the Panama banks were a critical place to launder money for both the drug lords and the gun runners. But it was also, Panama was for a long period of time, a centralized location for distribution of both drugs and guns throughout Latin, Central, and North America under Noriega's ruthless rule. People suspected that Noriega was behind the assassination and the death of his own prior president of Panama, who helped bring the Panama Canal back to Panama. That is who Manuel Noriega was. The problem was Manuel Noriega was a U.S. source dating back to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when he had been approached by U.S. intelligence in Panama while he was just in military school. He became a critical source of U.S. intelligence throughout that entire time period. So when he went AWOL, he went off the reservation like Saddam Hussein did in the late 90s, the net effect of it was that the political infrastructure here had to punish him. And so Poppy Bush, who had previously been head of the CIA during a time period in which Manuel Noriega was an informant for the CIA while working for the Panama government, needed to crush him. So we had the invasion of Panama and the arrest of Mr. Noriega. And the big question at his trial was going to be whether Noriega could defend himself against the allegations and accusations by pointing out that he was actually on the CIA's payroll while he was doing the things he was accused of doing in a U.S. court. Well, so they needed someone from the U.S. legal system to cover for Manuel Noriega, to make sure that Mr. Noriega could not report on the crimes that he did at the behest and the behalf of Poppy Bush and the CIA and the deep state. In steps Robert Mueller. Mr. Mueller would help manage and micromanage and supervise that prosecution and convince the federal judge to not even allow Mr. Noriega to tell the truth in his own defense, to not even allow him to voice what in fact was the reality and the facts and the history was that he had actually been working on behalf and at the behest of the CIA and other members of the deep state infrastructure when he was running guns, when he was running drugs, when he was involved in various criminal illicit activities that put Americans' well-being at risk. Once Mueller satisfied that objective, this was the third time he had helped fix the deep state's problems. Whitey Bulger in Boston, then BCCI, then Mr. Noriega. Then Poppy Bush lost his re-election bid, and Bill Clinton came in, and Mr. Robert Mueller went off to cash in and make millions of dollars in the private sector. He was there for a couple of years when he took a peculiar resume path. He then went to became an assistant prosecutor, not a head prosecutor, not a chief of any division of a prosecution unit. He'd gone from being one of the top people at the Department of Justice, making lots of money in the private sector, to becoming a low-level assistant in the homicide division in the District of Columbia. It seemed a peculiar and unusual transition. Now people would note later that, in fact, he could have, potentially, had the jurisdiction and authority to pursue deaths that happened in the Clinton administration during the time period that he was at the District of Columbia office. He did use his time there to argue for the cover-up of various FBI agents and misconduct that took place in Waco, Texas, as was later documented and detailed by Mr. Barr's book. Mr. Mueller used his connections to lobby for there to be a cover-up and no further action taken, adverse employment action taken, to any of the agents that led to the death of those people at Waco. But he not only did that, whatever he did at this low-level position while he was in the District of Columbia's office, two things did not happen. There was no investigation into the death of Ron Brown. Ron Brown was the Secretary of Commerce under President Clinton when he became under federal criminal grand jury investigation, and his own mistress turned rat. And the issue was whether Ron Brown, who was known as sort of the bag man for the Democratic Party for many decades, who got his name to fame originally through Reverend Jesse Jackson and then became a political fixer, such that it led him to be the Commerce Secretary in the President Clinton's cabinet, that took a unusual commerce trip. Usually you don't take a commerce trip to develop tourism or to develop commercial relationships in a country that is in a war zone. But that's what happened, apparently, to Commerce Secretary Brown when he was flying over a war zone and his plane went down and the black box was never found. There was the possibility, if the District of Columbia's office had chosen, where Robert Mueller was now working, to investigate that as a potential homicide. It was never investigated. Nor did the District of Columbia office meaningfully exercise any discretion or authority to investigate another death that happened under somewhat suspicious circumstances, in the case of Vince Foster, the White House counsel, who reportedly had all of the secrets of the Clintons in his own mind. After that happened, the next extraordinary thing in Robert Mueller's career took place. Mr. Mueller then got a promotion, a transfer, by the Clinton administration. Here's a Republican, high-ranking Republican, 30-year Republican, only appointed by Republicans, highly and well-connected in Republican political circles, gets a Democratic president to nominate him for one of the most prestigious gigs in the entire prosecutorial arena, to be the head prosecutor for the Northern District of California in San Francisco, the second most plum gig outside of the Southern District of New York for any politically ambitious Democratic lawyer. Why did Robert Mueller go from being a low-level District of Columbia prosecutor suddenly to getting this prime gig under a Democratic president? It's never been explained. Then he goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California, where another one of his peculiar cases takes place. Towards the end of his term, there was a raid by local state officials in a California state prosecution, county prosecution, of the son of a famous science fiction writer, Mr. Asimov. When they did their raid, they found not only what appeared to be child pornography, but also the ability to make and create child pornography. These stories started leaking out to the local press by the police officers, who were shocked and horrified by what they saw. Within about a year, year and a half, 2 years, suddenly, all of a sudden, the feds swoop in, and Mr. Mueller takes over the case. He will wait about a year or so until the case quietly dies. Mr. Asimov will see no time in a federal prison. He'll have his own equipment and everything returned to him. Within a couple of months of that deal getting done, Mr. Mueller had a new nomination. He was made the FBI director under George W. Bush.
It is my honor to nominate Robert S. Mueller of California to become the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
In fact, he was made FBI director very soon before the next big deep state scandal would occur, 9/11. So there had been suspicion and some theories for some time that Mr. Mueller used Mr. Asimov to gain access to names of identities of individuals who are high profile and politically connected, who had been involved in either the production or purchase of child pornography. Whether it's true or not is still unknown because it was never fully investigated or vetted. The congressional committees that oversaw Mr. Mueller's appointment to the FBI chose not to ask a single question about it. Once Mr. Mueller got to the FBI, within weeks, 9/11 occurs. What is Mr. Mueller's first action and reaction? As is well documented in stories like the Looming Tower and others, the ground agent of the FBI was giving notice to their hierarchy that there were serious problems afoot, including, in fact, key-ranking members of the FBI's anti-terrorism division were reporting serious concerns. The FBI ignored those concerns on the 7th floor of their political hierarchy. So there were FBI agents warning about people learning to only take off on planes and not land, people who were using FBI informants in San Diego and Southern California who would end up being one of the 21 pilots or people involved in the terror events of 9/11, or at least alleged or accused to be. And in addition to that, there was concerns about all of bin Laden's connections, family and political and financial connections, of people that were here in the United States at the time of 9/11. What did Robert Mueller do? Well, first, he helped many of the key people that were connected to the Saudis and connected to the bin Laden family to escape the United States without any meaningful investigation into them, with secret flights out during a time period in which no flights were actually supposed to be allowed at all, least of all for potential suspects or persons of interest with knowledge and information that could be relevant and significant to the investigation into what actually happened at 9/11. But it went beyond that. Mr. Mueller did a massive cover-up campaign to make sure that nobody would find out for almost a decade that the FBI's ground-level agents, their field agents, had been documenting and detailing concerns that the 7th floor had stayed quiet and mute about. Indeed, one of the key FBI agents who was documenting problems was the head of security at the World Trade Center and died that day. So much of his information went with him. And Robert Mueller would spend the next better part of a half a decade covering up what he knew and other people knew that the FBI didn't act upon for political reasons or unexplained reasons.
Mueller has confronted this mounting evidence, and he's candidly admitted what we all now realize, that today we can't say for sure whether the 9/11 attacks might have been stopped if all the dots had been connected and all the leads been followed. And I commend the director for the candor of his recent statements.
That would not be the end of Robert Mueller's role as a deep state fix-it man. He would not only be an FBI director under George W. Bush, Barack Obama would continue the bipartisan role of Robert Mueller as a deep state fix-it man and allow him to continue on as FBI director even after he took over. During this time period, Robert Mueller would take critical steps to cover up anything that could implicate high-ranking members of the FBI, our law enforcement or intelligence branches, or what is loosely or colloquially known as the deep state.
President Trump hasn't even been in office a full year yet, but that hasn't stopped the deep state from waging an all-out war against him.
The Democrats are working together with the deep state to discredit the duly elected president of the United States while ignoring their own crimes and misconduct.
It's a form of a coup. This is very dangerous for our country. I regard the Mueller example as the deep state at its very worst, and it worries me a great deal.
This has reached
crisis proportions without a doubt.
Members of the deep state, these are rogue elements in the permanent bureaucracy.
The deep state now working overtime, working to subvert President Trump and his entire administration.
This is how the deep state operates. They did it to me personally as a member of Congress when I was the chairman of the Oversight Committee. I had the Secret Service, more than 40 agents dove into my background because they wanted to embarrass me.
This has become a supra-authority that now has more power than the President of the United States, not envisioned by the Constitution in any way, shape, or form. Why the hell should we put up with it?
Had someone come to me a year ago and said this is what we would be dealing with now, I really would have thought of it as a conspiracy theory. But what we have seen take place over the last 18 months in the federal bureaucracy has been nothing short of a wholesale repudiation of the election and an effort by entrenched bureaucrats to overturn it.
The people in the deep state, they do not like transparency. They don't want accountability. They don't want to be called on the mat. And when a disruptive personality like Donald Trump and his team come along, they want to flee. They don't like the sunshine. They don't like that.
Are there forces in the United States that are more powerful than Congress? More powerful than the President of the United States, more powerful than the President and the Congress combined?
To get in the leadership, it's not, you don't earn your stripes. That was one thing that I had made a decision even before I went to Washington. And while I was there, if I had set my goal as to become chairman of the banking committee, I would have had to sell my soul, really, in a way. You do exactly what they tell you. You raise a lot of money, and it costs a couple million. Now it's probably $5 or $10 million to deliver to the party. And you have to do that by kowtowing to the powerful special interests, mainly the military-industrial complex.
The term the deep state would in fact originate from an 1860s, 1870s economist writer who simply called it the dual state, trying to explain the phenomenon to where democratic forces had less and less control over the day-to-day operations of government. At that point, it was sort of loosely or colloquially called the administrative state. But in its law enforcement and intelligence branches, where people were obtaining power and unable to be removed or their policies changed no matter what happened in the elections, led to the phrase deep state. It would be popularized and colloquialized again by a group of scholars from Germany in the early 1930s who were trying to explain the rise of fascism. They began to understand what fascism was about and where it came from, based on this dual state notion, that increasingly there were people who controlled military, law enforcement, and intelligence branches of government that were immune from democratic forces, that were removed from the democratic process, that they stayed, like J. Edgar Hoover, no matter what happened politically, no matter who controlled the House, who controlled the Senate, who controlled the Parliament, who controlled the presidency of any government or the prime minister of any government. That in each case and in every case, the political powers that be that control the equivalents of the CIA, whether here or overseas, the high-ranking Defense Department individuals, the high-ranking law enforcement people that should have been political appointees and subject to the political process, were increasingly their own government. Hence the dual state notion, another state outside of, independent of, separate from the democratically controlled political process. And that became known as the deep state in the late 60s and early 70s, originally an idea initiated and brought about by the political left to try to explain the way Hoover was able to operate independent of political process, the way the CIA was able to do coups or MK-Ultra independent of and separate from the political process, and whether that political process is the press and public knowledge, or the political process is the legislative bodies that were supposed to be controlling their funding and overseeing them, or the executive branch and the elected head of the executive branch themselves. There's a reason why a general like Eisenhower voiced his concerns in 1959. He was witnessing the dual state, the deep state in action that was so powerful that even a general, former general, and a president of the United States felt he could no longer control them, that he needed the public to be aware of their activities so there could be more electoral and democratic, little d, democratic control of the dual state, deep state operation that was entrenching and institutionalizing its political power, using its control over the intelligence infrastructure, the military infrastructure, and the law enforcement infrastructure, and the blackmail and extortion files that they were able to acquire and acquisition through that in order to achieve and obtain their power and to keep and protect and preserve that power at all costs. Mr. Mueller understood the deep state, had been its key advocate, had been its key protector, had been its key enabler throughout his entire political career. The family heritage that he inherited of protecting privilege and power was extended to the dual state and the deep state during his tenure, both as a prosecutor and as FBI director. So when he is FBI director, not only is he involved in issues related to 9/11 cover-up of FBI whistleblower activity that was suppressed by the 7th floor hierarchy, but in addition to that, he will later protect the second level of bank money laundering allegations for rogue states, for drug dealers, for terrorists, for people running arms, for people running drugs, and that would be the HSBC case. So HSBC would come under scrutiny because it was the bank of choice for Mexican drug cartels and the bank of choice for various terror running operations, just like BCCI was the focus in the early 1990s. Once again, Robert Mueller would step in. The net effect of his intervention would be to limit HSB's prosecution to just some criminal fines, protect high-ranking executives from any degree of exposure, and make sure that its role as a deep state facilitator and enabler of corrupt activities around the world would be covered up and hidden. Nobody within the hierarchy of the intelligence infrastructure, the law enforcement infrastructure, the defense infrastructure of either here or around the world would be implicated by the HSBC scandal, thanks to the role of Robert Mueller. Mr. Mueller wouldn't stop there. Mr. Mueller would help cover up the IRS Tea Party inquiry. That began when the IRS began to target people simply because of their association with known 501c3s or 501c4s, which are public charities and foundations that engage in public activity. They targeted those associated with the words Tea Party or the words tax protester. They targeted these individuals for harassment, for audit, for selective prosecution, for investigation, for politically motivated censorship and shame campaigns with imprisonment as a potential option, or possibly bankrupting individuals as purely based on their political affiliations and associations. Who came to the rescue of the IRS's corrupt activity, despite multiple IRS commissioners taking the fifth and refusing to produce their own documents and deleting and destroying emails and other relevant records? Robert Mueller. Once again, he would cover for the IRS's role as a tool of the dual state and the deep state to harass those they consider their ideological or political adversaries, who can be either on the left or the right. Mr. Mueller wouldn't stop there. When the FBI and the DEA and others became involved in a very questionable activity of trying to control guns, and trying to control guns by actually spreading those guns to Mexican drug cartels, known as the Fast and Furious scandal, when those guns ended up being used against U.S. law enforcement personnel, who was the person to cover for two different attorney generals who either refused or were in contempt of Congress based on their failure to testify and their omission of relevant records? Robert Mueller, while he was director of the FBI. Fast and Furious, covered up. IRS Tea Party, covered up. HSBC, covered up. BCCI, covered up. Noriega, covered up. Whitey Bulger, covered up. The Asimov case, covered up. But we're not done. Another critical person involved with high-ranking political individuals who appeared to be involved in basically prostituting and pimping out underage minor girls to high-profile political celebrities and other people, including allegedly royal family members around the world, Mr. Jeffrey Epstein was under prosecution and investigation when he was exposed for his nefarious conduct in Miami and New York during the time period that Robert Mueller was the director of the FBI. Mr. Epstein would get a very strange, sweetheart deal that would be covered up for the better part of half a decade, thanks to the activities of Mr. Mueller, and later rumors would spread and stories would document that in fact it appeared Mr. Epstein acted as an informant for Mr. Mueller, basically providing him sort of a blacklist that he could blackmail or that he could extort or that he could have special information in to protect the political prerogatives and prejudices of the dual state, deep state that he had long been a loyal servant of.
12 years is long.
All right, this is a good indication of what a traitor is. That's why we have this rope here. I hope they use it on Mueller, because they should put it around his neck. That's what they should do to traitors. And meanwhile, that's my point. You got Jerry DeLemus and Greg Burleson sitting in prison for doing nothing. And you've got this clown holding up the country because he's a criminal, hardcore criminal. And he should be tried, executed, once found guilty. Anyway, that's my point with this whole thing is that and anybody that says that, oh, this is all hocus pocus, doesn't mean anything, that's crazy. Too much circumstantial evidence. This guy is behind it, and so is the bar. I don't know if you heard some of the other names, Comey, whatnot. They're all lawyers. The bar is behind this, orchestrating the downfall of this country. And as soon as we kick them out, kick the banks out, and the IRS with them, we'll be fine. Anyway, please share this video. I ask that you look at it carefully, but share it with other people. Subscribe to our channel. Check out our new web page. And other than that, tune in next week. Pat Murphy will be back then. Thank you.